to have our session moderator and our panelists join us here on the main screen as well. This particular session will be moderated by architect Biju Kuriakose, who's the co-founder of Architecture Red, which is an award-winning architecture and urban design firm based in Chennai. So yes, Biju will be moderating the session, and joining him, let us also have these beautiful slides featuring all of our eminent speakers. While Biju moderates and spearheads this fabulous session, we're also joined by architect Sameer Padora, who's also here with us. Yes, that's right. Sameer Padora and Associates from Mumbai. And he's also our stalwart speaker joining us in. Up next, we have architect Abin Chaudhary of Abin Design Studio, Kolkata. We're also joined by architect Vinayak Bharne of the Marlin Polizoids and Urbanists, Architects and Urbanists. He's also joining us all the way from LA. And we also have with us architect Leena Kumar. So Leena has also joined us in Kumar Consultants, Bengaluru. So that's right. It's going to be a very, very interesting session. We will get this panel discussion started.
I want to thank IIA for inviting me to moderate this panel discussion. The topic is inclusive, and I must say that the topic itself is quite wide and inclusive, and hence we will try to narrow it down to focus on discussing about the challenges and possibilities of, say, building inclusive societies, public spaces, and cities. We'll also try and briefly talk about the role of the architects and the collective, our professional bodies, in negotiating and facilitating these positive transformations. The quality of our buildings and spaces we design has a strong influence on our lives, and hence the decisions of design and planning places can enhance or restrict a sense of belonging. And they have the potential to kind of remove the imagined barriers between our communities. And even though accessibility has improved, the fact is that most of our poor and disadvantaged people are expected to live in similar conditions even going forward in poor quality environments. And social, cultural, and economic inequalities are still being literally built into our new places. And planners and designers really need to examine more closely the impact of their decisions. So whose city is it? Are today's planning and decision-making processes suited to design a socially inclusive society? And in times like this, where digitalization, migration, and climate crisis all happening at the same time, the creation of places to connect people has become one of the most crucial tasks for us as architects and urban designers. And in many ways, a new generation of public spaces and buildings are needed to facilitate this dialogue between different cultures, genders, and our environmental challenges. So then how can architecture be a catalyst to facilitate a new culture of these openness and inclusion, creating permeable territories as real social contenders and bringing in sustainable solutions? And in a world where, in many ways, wealth dictates access today, how does an architecture practice situate itself to effect its desired role as practitioner, firmly rooted in the sphere of public, to facilitate an inclusive development? How does the practice respond to an increasingly challenging socio-economic and political environment, especially if it chooses to place itself within that context? And what are the negotiations possible? So these are some of the questions that we will try to dwell today, and we are joined by four wonderful panelists. Leena Kumar from Bangalore. She has her own practice called Kumar Associates. She is currently the chairperson of the IIA Karnataka chapter, and I welcome Leena to the panel.
Thank you.
We have Abin Chaudhary from Kolkata. Abin heads Abin Design Studio. It's a studio which is engaged in the design within the urban fabric and the peri-urban edge as a catalyst for deliberate change. I welcome Abin. We have Sameer from Mumbai. He's the founder of Sameer Padora and Associates, and his practice has received many national and international awards. Besides the practice, architecture practice itself, Padora runs a not-for-profit organization called SPARE, S-P-A-R-E, and I welcome Sameer. And we have Vinayak from far away from Los Angeles, Vinayak Bharne. He is a principal and director of design at Mall and Polizoids Architects and Urbanists in Los Angeles. He is also the adjunct associate professor of urbanism at the University of Southern California. So I welcome all of you. Look forward to a wonderful discussion. What we have put together is each of the panelists will start with a brief presentation discussing through their projects or their experiences, whether it's built, unbuilt, or the kind of work that they get involved within the practice, to demonstrate a way to engage with this challenging context that I kind of briefed about. And the negotiations possible, keeping in mind the complexities of various cities actors, the politics, the place, the people, and the profit. So each one of the panelists will give a brief presentation, and then we will get into a discussion after that. So we will start with Lena.
Okay, so this is the first slide, and this was a carpet exhibition. The clients came to us and they were starting a new showroom in Bangalore, and they said, why don't we display our carpets? And they had taken up a space to just hang their carpets for display. So I suggested to them that we have the display as more as pieces of art instead of just carpets. And this is what we came out with. There was an open space in the center. Everything had to be done in literally overnight. And I believe that because of the design and, the forms that we had, the designs that we put forward, it was quite an inclusive design. And a lot of the people who went past, most of them stopped, they went around, they had a look, and then they went into the showroom. And I believe that this was really through the interest of the design. It was not something that was exclusive. It was not something that, kept you away. It quite welcomed you. And he had a very good response to this. Well, at the end of 2 days, we had to remove it. That was quite sad. But this was our design for Carpet Splendor. And so generally, we do try to engage with the public, even through exhibitions, and try to tell the clients that, let's go beyond just hanging something and having a opening. That's Carpet Splendor. That was done in Bangalore. So this is something that we've just finished. And in fact, this picture is nearing completion. And this is Starbucks in Bangalore. It's at an important junction. And usually Starbucks, what we have in Bangalore, they're quite boring, just glass facaded buildings. And they have the name Starbucks that gets people inside. But in this particular design, we said, let's use wood and let's have a building that really sets in with the surrounding, with the setting. It's in a very nice corner. It's in upscale Bangalore. It's in Vittal Malya Road, if any of you know the city. And this building now welcomes people who do go to Starbucks and others too. And I think it's been quite a successful project. And in terms of business, which is what eventually any client wants, I think they're quite happy with their business. I think they've increased the business, and the building quite speaks to you and calls you out, and it sits very nicely in its setting. So this is Starbucks, something we've just finished. This is an interior project, and this is situated in a very busy street in Bangalore. It's actually in a market street. So people who go there, it's a street where they sell hardware. So the people who go there to buy, to purchase are, well, what do I say? Hardcore, if that's the word I have to use. And we designed this office in the midst of it all. We thought it could nudge people to really see the effect of design and nudge people to see that money spent in design is quite worth it. So there were no false ceilings. It was not a fancy office. It was quite raw. We had concrete floors. We had an open grid ceiling on top. We used color. And a lot of the people that did come into this shop, to this showroom, they were quite happy with the space. And a lot of them commented that it's nice. And I believe through designs like this, it was quite inclusive in the sense that the materials of it or the spaces was nothing that was elitist, if that's the word I should use. So I believe, projects like this, especially when it's situated in the middle of a space where most people think architecture is just a luxury and you don't really need architects to design spaces. When you do something like this, it does nudge them. It does give them a suggestion that engaging with an architect is perhaps worth it, because the space was comfortable. It was not an air-conditioned space, but we worked out a very detailed system of fresh air inlets, of fresh air exhausts, because it's in the middle of a crowded and polluted street. So in that sense, I think this is one of our more successful projects, because we've dealt with a clientele that we don't normally deal with. And it's been quite comfortable for people to come in and leave. We'll go to the next one. Okay, this was, we were shortlisted for the National War Memorial. It's a project we didn't get, and I think some of you would have seen it. But, in this design, instead of having normally, just concentric circles, we looked at a design and we really went into symbolism. So each one of our memorial walls was in the shape of symbols that connect with eternity, that connect with the cosmos, and it's a very Indian idea. As Indians, we are very symbolical about everything. Everything has it implies something. Every form, every detail, and this is the one that we did. So we came up with 6 forms. We went to the lotus, the shell, the spiral, and this was our design, because we thought that these are forms that people could connect with. So even when public come, even when you do come, especially people who've lost a near one, a dear one from their family, we thought this would really reach out, it would connect, and the scale was also very small. The each one of the memorials walls was just about 6 feet tall. It was not imposing, but it was more. It was meant to really to connect and invoke a sense of unity, of oneness with the whole. And we very consciously looked at symbolism, saying, this is Indian and this is who we are. So in that sense, we tried to make the design a lot more symbolical, and I think in forms that would reach out to most of the public, perhaps all the public, because this is something that we're used to seeing, that this is something that we're used to connecting. Fine, so we'll go to the next one. Okay, this one I put because it's a house that we did in Mysore, and the clients were Marwadis, and they always remember Rajasthan very fondly. So keeping that in mind, we used the stone that they've always seen. We used Dholpur stone, we've used arches, and they're all real arches. We got the stones, we got blocks, and in this, every block of the arch was detailed out at the site, and the workers that were there were just brilliant. I think I've not seen anyone do such wonderful arches after that. And even the way they created shade for themselves, they just had 4 bamboo poles. They had I wish I had taken pictures of it, but I didn't. And of course, Biju said 5 slides, nothing more than that. So that was it. Otherwise, I may have put something more. So, they used 4 bamboo poles. They had a cloth stretched on it, and they moved it around to get shelter from the sun. And that was it. And they sat under it, and they dressed those stones with complete joy. This is one of my most favorite projects. It's a small project, but everybody involved in it was in sync. And we had that big granite column over there that held the space frame at an edge, and that was all taken. They were all granite blocks taken to the lathe. They were turned in the lathe, got back with the crane, placed there precisely, to keep it vertical, to keep it straight. And it was brilliant because, more so because everybody worked in sync with each other. And even the site engineers came up with their own ideas. So generally, as an office, when we do projects, we're quite compassionate about what we do. And we are involved with the contractors, with the consultants, with the workers. And so the whole process becomes really very enjoyable.
Yeah.
This is, the latest one during this pandemic. So the drawings may not be so clear in what we're trying to say, but we did give a proposal to the government to say, and we called it the pavilion, and we suggested to them that in every open space that they have, in a maidan or in a park, if they really create a pavilion at one end, and you do all the, you work out a basic design, you do all the sewage lines, you do all the plumbing, and cover it with an inspection chamber. That's all you need to do. And in terms of a crisis, you just have to remove it and plug in toilets. I think it's an extremely workable solution, because when you do that, you have a whole Maidan there that's ready for you to put up temporary shelters, and it can very easily and simply convert into emergency situations where we don't have to repeat this whole idea of migrants having to go back, or if it's something to do with health. It works, and it's extremely simple. Well, I don't know how far it'll go. We call it the pavilion. It's simple, and I think this is one way that you don't have to treat a migrant like they're outside of us. They come to the city, they work, and when they go back, if they cannot go back, I think it's a duty to really at least be ready to house them and to take care of them. So we call this the pavilion, and well, if it has to work, then we really need to push. And working with the government is quite a task. It's full-time job almost. But sometimes I think, it's worth it. And we do try and do a lot of work like this.
So basically, the quick presentation is all about what we are trying beyond the city fabric, which is in kind of in peri-urban area, which is my hometown. And for last 10 years, we are trying to work on those projects. And this is the kind of the starting slides, which makes how the peri-urban migration is keep happening even today. And also, it is a kind of tendency to capture. Now, with the practice, we have understood, because I came from a kind of peri-urban area, like a hometown within busy kind of cluster. There will be a lot of crises, social, cultural, economic, political, and environmental, where I feel that when I practice, there is a lot of disconnect from the public and the practice or architecture as a kind of a professions. So there is no such a kind of inclusiveness. And this is the kind of things that I always feel that this is a very important part of our responsibility through a practice to connect those common people or people at a large, because they don't understand what architecture is as a practice is. And if the practice can really intervene their life and create some kind of meaningless for architectural practice, it makes sense. So in 2012, this is around 64 kilometers away from the city, and will be two villages shown. One is Bajberia and Adishaptagram. So our intervention for last 2 years in this particular city for 10 projects, and which started next. So it started with a kind of pavilion that we have actually done for a football pavilion. And because there is a cultural heritage, there will be an important football kind of pedigree of the multiple clubs. So we created this pavilion in 2012. And we choose this pavilion to intervene because the only one reason, because generally for this pandal or pavilion, thousand people comes together. And this is the kind of a right approach for us to actually intervene a kind of in public life, what a designer and architect can create and kind of a change. So that is one part of intervention, and that in fact is really resonate the idea of what really matters to the people. And if you see that the whole chart, which shows that then we start interventions on those particular areas of multiple projects, some of the private projects, along with the projects that we, as an agency, as an advocacy, as a studio, not only kind of create those projects, we actually take the responsibility of funding, we take responsibility of training those all those peoples, we take responsibility how to maintain those buildings, and we take responsibility how the public at a larger community at a large start engaging all those projects. And that's become one of the important factor where the studio is engaging for last 10 years. And this is kind of a completely inclusive way that the whole area has been developed through a consciousness how architecture and design can really penetrate their own life, and they can really feel that what architecture can make their life. And this comes and completely an wave of reciprocal. So it's not only about only designs. We connect to the local people, government start connecting to the community, then studios start creating fund, and then we have a multiple collaborators, and this way the governments and other things is becoming a kind of an we create an absolutely positive nexus to create an architecture and more penetrative in this local life. Next. So this is a kind of web which we have actually generate, because each wave has each projects and each captures in multiple factors. Is not only about the understanding of local people trainings, is also creating a job creation. It's also creating how we are managing the design explorations, how we are managing the local people involved in this project. So be an almost an kind of a detailed analysis that we're creating for last 10 years. Next. So this is a kind of a glimpse of few projects. So the left hand side is also a kind of an community center that we created in the local the help of local bricks and the ceramics. Over there we have some private house. Then we have created an pavilion for the community village. And this community village is right now with the pavilion become a more resonance, because earlier what happened is the villagers right now start taking ownership of these projects. We did an interesting workshops over there. Right now it is under construction and completing in next 2 years, and it's creating an enormous job creations of the people over there, and almost more than 2,000 people are engaged on those kind of projects. And we are keep getting an invitations for multiple government agencies to collaborate with them, and how to create a change of notion, start making those within the budget, within the parameters of government nominations, how you really architectural practice can advocate all those projects to kind of people and meaningful for the local people. And this is the temple that we have created. This is a project that we just completed. This is a kind of community center and coaching center for the local people. We have collaborated with the people of ceramic artists. This is a pavilion for the gallery for the villagers, which start owning. So this is the temple. They start this temple has a completely deliberated situation. So we just precast lab train them, and they start owning those spaces. So this is the kind of, and this is the private house. So it all about an interventions, how a private house corner place can be pushed together and creating an even in privacy, but also a kind of a sense of responsibility to creating the people, that if you leave some kind of space of corner space, you avoid accident. So there is multiple work that we are right now doing, and that is why we feel that there is a lot of opportunity as a studio, as a practice, and architectural practice. We need to inclusiveness to penetrate on this peri-urban area where we can really make sense of our professions.
Cities across the world are different, not because of the way they look, but because of the way they are governed, because of the way they are administered. And this is one of the things that separates the US from India. The daily processes that make up physical environments and processes behind the scenes, chemistry that happens behind them, are very different. But the one thing I think we will all agree as architects is, no matter where we are in the world, as architects, we pride ourselves in having the expertise to sort of shape the physical crucibles that will give social life to a city. But the fact is, we are constantly and perpetually at the mercy of so many other actors, agencies, and forces on which we have no power and no control. If you think about it, as an architect, you're always brought into the situation after a number of decisions have already been made. So what this means is, if there's one definition of practice that is really a noun, which is the act of shaping the physical city, the other definition of practice is the verb, which is about seeking the conduits through which you will engage with all these other power structures that are much more powerful than you are. So I'm calling this presentation Many Protagonists, because the idea of inclusiveness is not there's one side of it which is an ethical issue and a righteous issue and about social justice and so on. But there's another side of it which is incredibly pragmatic, which is that as architects, we don't have the power to shape the city in as much an influential way without these other actors. So for example, here's a project in a second-tier city in California called Lancaster. Now, it was the city officials that decided to invest $14 million that they had received from a federal grant to resurrect the disinvested main street of the city, which is the slide you see to the top left. Now, we came in as designers and we did our part. But the beauty of this is you had a community that would have been significantly inconvenienced. This is a mile-long street. Their businesses would have to be shut down. They all cooperated, supported this scheme. It was done in 3 phases. And in 8 months, we managed to construct this because of the municipal support that we received and the community support that we received. The point I'm making is this project may have its design value, but at the end of the day, there were 3 powerful agents of change. The designers played their role, the municipality was the visionary that really made this project happen, and the community backed it. And without these 3 and the chemistry of these 3, this project wouldn't have happened. Now, the other issue is, what this project has really done for the city, a very low-income city actually, is it has brought back $300 million of economic development investment back into the city. So they invested $14 million, they got back $300 million in 2 years. So the point is, when you forge inclusive processes to shape public space, you're not only bridging the economic gaps of the rich and the poor, you're also creating a potent economic development strategy that can raise the prosperity index of certain cities that otherwise wouldn't have it. Next. The second kind of actors that shape cities in a powerful way, at least in the US, are citizens. I mean, this is a project where, in the city I live in, Pasadena, where just enlightened citizens were deeply concerned about a freeway that would have been constructed and would have fractured the city. You can see the stub of the freeway in the black and white photograph. That actually fractures the city and creates a west side of the city and east side of the city. I don't know to tell you, it practically fractures the communities. And these concerned citizens came together, formed an organization called Reconnecting Pasadena. All of us were brought in as consultants, but frankly, we got in as citizens of a city. It was not, I'm an architect, you're a developer or anything. We were just concerned by the impacts of this toxic freeway. And the long story short is, we've now, through 3 or 4 workshops, photographs are right there, managed to transform this stub, which is incredible amounts of real estate, into a new development with a boulevard that will carry the traffic, a new development that will stitch the city together. And negotiating with the metro authorities, the citizens have actually managed to stop this freeway from happening. So where I'm going with this one is there is a side of practice that is activist, and that the protagonists of envisioning transformation in a city is not necessarily architects, but concerned and enlightened citizens who plant the seeds of incredible ideas. Next. This is Del Mar Station. I mean, one of the most beautiful aspects of inclusiveness is to create rights that are equal for everyone. And one of the most important things many cities are doing is tackling mobility. Because while you and I may own a car and we may have choices of travel, there are hundreds of thousands of people out there who simply don't have a car, and public transit is their only option. So I don't have to tell you this, you all know this, but the idea of densifying transit nodes into affordable housing, into entire blocks that are villages in themselves, becomes a very crucial way of understanding the city. So here's a project where there were 3 agencies that made this possible. You can see that the train tracks go through the middle of the block. So you had the metro authorities who owned the right-of-way. You had the developer who wanted 350 units of housing. You had the city officials who enabled 10 variances to the existing zoning code. Variances are violations or exceptions to the zoning code that are given to us on the basis of merit if they think the project is going to be better by going beyond the existing zoning code. So there were 10 of them which came through, and finally the designers playing their role in it. But the point I'm making, a progressive development of any kind never happens alone. This is an office building that was recently finished by our office, and this is the only project in my 20-year career where I have seen communities literally designing the project. So there was another project designed on the site in a more abstract form, and this is the historic heart of the city. So the neighborhood association of the city sued the city because they felt that the abstract building was not incompatible with the character of the historic setting. And they won the case, and they hired a new architect, in this case us, to really design this building with them. And obviously, this is an Art Deco inspired building. But the point I'm making is that this is one of those unique cases where the aesthetic expression of the building does not emerge from the preconceptions of an architect. I think this is what architecture ought to be. It emerges from a discursive process in which the community, the stakeholders, come to the table and ask what architecture wants to be. The point I'm making here is that if you're really talking about inclusiveness, we have to bring pluralism into architecture. We cannot be reductive in thinking of architecture in only one way. There are different kinds of architecture, different processes, different idioms, different products. To bring them all onto the table is what inclusiveness is about. And finally, the process of practice. This is a significant project to design a new neighborhood for one of the poorest communities in North America, in the United States, in Fresno, and an African American community. And the point is, the process through which this neighborhood is generated is not the supra expert coming in and designing this magnificent sort of big settlement, but really, you can see it, a table where sitting for a week and doing vignettes, which begins to have the community own and have a say in the kind of spaces that they want, which immediately begins to garner support for what they want and how we might be able to get there. So I'll leave you with this thought. There's one more slide, Biju, if you could just go there. The eventual line, two things. One, we're going through unprecedented times. This is a book we released last year. Samit Padura has a wonderful essay in it. There's one side where this book is about 30 case studies all over the world of how different cities, in their own circumstances, are tackling the issue of inclusiveness and affordability. But the left-hand one is more important to me, because if there's anything COVID-19 has taught us, it is that, it's brought back health, the issue of health, back to our psyche. It's brought back the fact that our oceans are cleaner, our forests are breathing better, there are thousands of animals who are returning back to the city, so on and so forth. So the real question here is, while we talk as architects about all the lovely things we can do, the fact is we don't know all the answers. To find all the answers, we need to figure out all of the multidisciplinary experts that come to the table, talk to them. And eventually, what is the extent and the sphere, the radius or the sphere of our inclusiveness? Can we actually begin to talk about multi-species, not just humans in terms of diversity, but the many other denizens with which we share our cities?
Biju actually started off with setting the mandate of the discussion being very focused on a certain realm of architecture or its capacity. But I'm actually going to start off by going much wider. I'm going to talk about, just the thematic, the fact that we're talking about inclusiveness and the fact that, for instance, if we just take the panel that we are on, out of five panelists, there is just one woman. And really, it's also a question about how we look at gender and how that is a challenge that we have to address. And not just gender, but also the idea of class. If anything, this current pandemic has only exacerbated the fault lines that already exist within our city. And we've seen, as Lina was pointing out earlier as well, that how poorer sections of our citizenry is actually treated, and the migration from the cities was if anything a kind of wake-up call for us to acknowledge that. And while we're talking about class, there's also this huge issue of caste, and we might, sitting in cities, not discuss this as much, but there is an entire landscape that lies beyond our kind of confined worlds where caste becomes a hugely problematic issue as well. And I'm bringing these issues, these larger issues, up primarily not through the advent of talking about a solution, but through the kind of discipline of architecture, because I don't know whether architecture as yet really has the capacity to answer these complex questions, but really to, in some sense, also make the idea of practice also about asking those questions. And if we have to ask these questions, what we have to constantly do is also reimagine the practice. the way that we actually look at an architectural practice. This slide that you see right now is really from the Seoul Biennale, where we were invited to participate with our work. And it talks about how within my current work, we actually have four kinds of directions. One which talks about traditional studio model of practice, the way that we are actually taught to practice architecture. The second is really to talk about all of the actors who are in producing architecture or environments that we think we are the authors of. So the collaborative project. The third is to also acknowledge the fact that perhaps this is no longer about the single individual, and it's really about what capacities the collective has, and how these actors together can actually look at producing these environments. And lastly, the fact is that research, which we constantly tend to compartmentalize and put away as being in opposition or as being distinct from the practice, is also flawed. The fact that research really becomes a means to inform the practice, and I think it's for us within our practice, it's these four ideas that actually look at questioning the model of practice, but also in some sense then raising questions about the institutions that architecture operates under. So this was really at the Seoul Biennale, where we were invited to show our work, but what we were also invited to do was to curate a small section that looked at Indian practices, and we put together these 10 practices that we thought worked within certain capacities that were completely different. Next. And these practices, in some sense, were collated under four large categories. One was the idea of collective resistance, where advocacy, as something that Vinayak was talking about, becomes a hugely important tool, where projective capacities are also dependent on the kinds of communities you work with, where legal instruments become hugely important. Similarly, there was this idea about celebratory architecture, and how the idea of people and the way that they actually celebrate events in the cities becomes a format for the practice to intervene in. Abhin's own work that he mentioned earlier, the bus ride, the Start India Foundation, all of these practices actually operate within this idea of a practice that references the way that people occupy public space in cities. Architecture Red, Biju's work, and the way that public open space can be reimagined, along with the work that we do here in Bombay with the Bandra Collective. That's looking at the idea of the public good, and the way that design can actually look at fashioning public space. And the fourth category is really looking at the idea of memory, and how do we actually look at history. Given today's time, where really the optics of history can be massaged to create different kinds of narratives, I think it's really important that the work that people like Rohan Shivkumar and Riaz from Antidote Design are doing becomes a repository for us to also think back about the agency, the projective capacity, and the criticality of the kind of work that has been produced in the past. Next. So I'm just quickly running you through some of these panels. There is the work of P.K. Das's work on open spaces in Bombay. It has been hugely instrumental in creating public space. The work of Shweta, Hussain, and Mihir through the collection for the Collective for Spatial Alternatives, and their work resisting the kind of environmental degradation that happens due to large infrastructure projects in the city of Mumbai has been incredible. Neera and Arvind's work on housing in Bombay. Neera's book on milllands and its appropriation is fantastic. Arvind's work I've already mentioned. Start India Foundation, where they actually look at how art can be taken to derelict districts in the city to actually, in some sense, both reimagine and revitalize those sections. Bus Ride, and there look at history and almost a kind of tongue-in-cheek reference to heritage, and how that can actually become also a commentary on the way that we imagine our cities. Architecture Red, I've already mentioned Biju's work in Chennai. The Bandra Collective and our work, both before the pandemic on public spaces, but also now actually reimagining public spaces for post-lockdown scenarios. And finally, the work of the Antidote Design Studio, looking at heritage architecture and its capacities and roles in today's cities. So I'm just going to end here and just talk about the fact that I think what we really need to kind of realize is that talking about inclusivity also means that we have to also talk about how architecture, in some sense, needs to move beyond its traditional role as being a profession that provides a service, but rather as a profession that also has a role in reimagining what projects a city needs and how to actually create interfaces with the various actors that would in the end use these projects.
Thank you all for the wonderful presentation. I think it is one thing is very clear is that, and the most interesting part in all the presentations in many ways is this proactive approach to engage with the larger context, and not just physically, but also to deal with the certain or address or engage with the issues that concerns all of us. And in some ways it's also about moving away from, like Samir was saying, moving away in some sense about, or even Abhin's work, about the sort of the traditional reactionary approach of practice and start to kind of take a more proactive approach, so it also shows that this is in many ways is the only way we can start to then engage and try to kind of build a certain kind of inclusive society within our cities and within our communities. And if that is the case, and I would like to ask all of you, is that how do we then kind of prepare these new young architects who are coming in? I mean, this is, in many sense, what many of you talked about is not something which is taught in architecture schools. All right. So how do we need to? I mean, it's also about reimagining that traditional practice to be able to engage in multiple roles. So how do we kind of maybe then start to teach this, or how do we kind of communicate this to the young professionals who come out to kind of wanting to come out and start to practice? And so I would like your perspective on that. I mean, Samir, maybe you can start with it because you kind of really touched upon that, and give your insights on based on your experience and what you see at academic level you need to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Biju, the point that you raised is also something that I had referenced, where I talk about how institutions, in some sense, need to also ask these questions. Because while we are trying to figure this out in some sense as we go along, it's very ad hoc in that sense, right? For instance, when we were looking at the work that we are doing here with the Bandra Collective, we were trying to be included in some sense in the process. So when we talk about inclusiveness, I think at some level we found that we as architects, who in some sense have a mandate to design space, were ourselves not being included. And I think what also needs to be addressed here is a larger perception that as architects, the only thing that we can actually bring to the table is an aesthetic value. That we do not bring anything more than beautification of a street or a promenade. And I think when we start associating value, not perceived value, but real value with the environment, and we are able to quantify that through the discussions that we have in school, that is when you start also seeing students or the future generation of architects starting to look for that additional layer that talks about value that can be quantified, not just the fact that there is a kind of esoteric idea about how light hits a wall and that should really answer all the pragmatic questions you have that people have when they use spaces. So it's also got to be really about finding answers to real real hard questions that society has, not just what lies within the kind of language of architecture.
I mean, you want to, because I really don't think the way you've imagined the practice today or the last few years is something that definitely not taught in school at all. I mean, in the way you start to really take ownership of these projects from start to the end. Do you want to kind of throw in some light into how you see this process? And in some ways, I also want to say, and this is probably the next question which I would like to ask, is that in some ways, it is also a frustration with the current status quo, in the sense that you really can't engage in and make a difference within the current way of practicing, and then you start to then reinvent new ways of kind of engage with that context.
So my frustrations or a kind of a gap of understanding on my practice is always a kind of provoke me what we as a practice what really I can really contribute. Now, my understanding of those kind of an practice or being in out of the city, kind of uh, taking the basic references of how the public building, PW building, and Panchayat building is keep happening. There is no sense of respect of a profession, and I believe that sense of respect of professions only comes when you really start contributing what and start understanding the it's not about the design ideas what Samip is talking about. It's not about aesthetics. It's all about the idea of knowing people's mind and the people's what people are looking for, what community is looking for, what the government has to go for some kind of a procedures. And then we start feeling that this is the only possible in our country. Probably this is my idea. The moment you, so I really give an example in a Gladiator movie that the people are saying that you need to really win the people's mind. Okay, so the pavilion is a starting point for me when the thousand of people are start seeing and understanding what it is. Then something people are not understanding, some people are really recollecting all those things, and you start hammering those things, and this is the starting point. And then we probably on a single project on Bajbiri Adishotogram, probably the design involvement is a 20% and 80% is talking to the people, talking to the PWD engineer, talking to the getting the money fund and start collecting all the community people. Let's do something, get the training done. So it's a day and night kind of involvement that we thought. And then you and myself and Samir also discussed multiple times what could be the alternative practice that we really can make sure that things that we are trying to make, it's not about the ideas. Things can make sure that it's not only the ideas, it implemented to the people, for the people and by the people who are really involved in this process, and
Yeah,
then it makes sense.
yeah, and it's. I mean, I have to say that what's wonderful about what you showed is also the fact that, I mean, they're not curated. I mean, you went from one to another. I mean, you probably didn't have a vision as to what the end all these things adds up to, but you kind of took it one step and and in many levels that inclusivity kind of came through it, because it's because you wanted to learn, you start to engage in different ways, and that kind of led it into creating something in some sense fragmented but yet tied by certain thoughts and kind of approach, you know.
Yeah.
And I want to, Lena, I want to address this question to you. I mean, and this is also what I was telling you earlier. I mean, yesterday Rahul Mehrotra in his presentation talked about two spheres that architects needs to be negotiating. One is the sphere of concern, and the other one is the sphere of influence. And he was talking about the fact that, you know, in today our sphere of concern is increasing multifold, while our sphere of influence is diminishing day by day, right, as architects. Now, if that is the case, what is, I mean, since you were also involved more actively in professional bodies, what is the role of professional bodies to kind of try and make sure that there is a environment created to have a larger influence of or larger sphere of influence? And I will give you one more. I want to kind of cite one more example. I mean, if you look at Abin and Samip, what they largely talked about is also a certain kind of frustration in practices of this generation or the next generation that is coming out, to be able to have the lack of opportunity to be involved, to include in the public process. In other words, practices like many of those practices can't even look to kind of get engaged in public projects. I mean, because public projects comes with a certain kind of criteria, etc. And naturally, these young practices are in many ways excluded from this process. And this is where the energy is, right? I mean, if you look at I mean, there are so many young architects today coming out with so much energy, and there is a lack of way they can, I mean, there is, in some ways they are excluded from getting engaged into this process. So do we, and the same with women architects. And I mean, I think I always say that there is there are young architects with energy and there are women architects with compassion, and both needs to be included in this process to be able to create inclusive societies. And how do we kind of then make structural changes within our professional, through our professional bodies, not within our, through our professional bodies, that because that is in the end which can bring in the change. How do we kind of start to influence that?
Well, yes, you're right. One is to be inclusive in public projects or to be seen as an influencer as architects. It's not the right of an architect. That's the first thing we've got to understand. So, and if we really want to be inclusive, if we want to make a difference, there's a price to pay for it, which is your time and your involvement. And if you look at the younger generation, a lot of them are in a hurry. They want things fast, and that doesn't really work. So if you really understand that, I think to get involved with the public, and especially as an institution, is not difficult at all. In fact, as the IIA in Karnataka, we did get involved with a ward committee in Bangalore, a local ward, and we tried to engage with the public. We had meetings. We called them. We mapped the ward. We met the residents, and it was quite an exercise. But to see it through, let's say we wanted to take this to a situation where they actually implemented. And the intent that we started with was that you implement something, not that we make a document and say this is how you map wards and this is how architects can engage with residents or neighborhoods and come up with something. But to implement it is such tremendous work. It takes a long time, but if you are perseverant about it, it can be done. And really, if you ask me, that's the role of an institute, because an institute can do is difficult as an individual practice.
Correct.
You're engaged in practice, and that takes up a lot of time itself. So when you're talking to the larger community, it's much easier and it's possible. So we went to the extent of meeting the corporator who even came and told us, look, you give me a design, you tell me what you have to do, and I'll have it implemented. But that's a lot of work. I mean, you've got to go, you've got to design. We started with saying, okay, why don't you just give us a survey of the place, with levels, and we'll work out your stormwater drain, we'll work out floodings. But he said, no, you get it done. So, which really translates to money being there, and but we can work systems out, and I think it's possible, and that's really the role of an institute. And it was quite an exciting term really with the Karnataka chapter of the IIA, and we have urged many architectural practices to really join the institute because collectively you can do. But there's a great reluctance amongst practices also because it's time and everyone feels there's a lot of, politics and so on. Yeah, sure there is. But we have to come to a stage when life is not going to hand out things to you just the way you want it. It's always a negotiation. It's always a give and a take. And if you're willing to give and take, we can come together. And as architects, there is plenty that we can do. I mean, keep excuses aside, but we can if there's a wish, and if everyone is, patient enough, if everyone's willing to put in time, if everyone's willing to put in effort and come together collectively. Otherwise we're largely individuals as architects.
Yeah, I think this is a discussion. I think this is a discussion we need to continue and take forward because this is extremely important. Just quiz in one question to Vinayak, and I think Vinayak, I'm sure you already have a lot of opinion on almost all the kind of things that we discussed today. But I also want to ask you a completely different question. You talked about process, and I just wanted to ask you: is that at what point do you think the process comes in the way of creativity? And this is in some ways a personal question as well because I practiced in US for almost 10 years before I moved back. And the most fascinating part about practicing in India is the uncertainty, I mean, and that is where practices like Abin, Samir, and many others kind of start to, I mean, it start to kind of figure out new ways of practicing, right? And while in United States, the process is set so much that, how do you then kind of break away from that? Do you feel that at some point these processes also needs to be questioned and reimagined?
I think, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Biju, there is no part of the world that's perfect. I think we will all agree with that. Every city, every place in the world, every society has its issues. So I think to compare them is fallacious and ridiculous, in my opinion. And here's why. In the US, as you know, because you practice there as well, we live in a very over-regulated society. You've experienced this. Everything is transparent. Everything is high accountability. There's no murkiness. There's a lot of stringency. But what this means, this is the anathema of the U.S. form of practice, right? Which is because the legal responsibilities are so precarious, so sensitive. Even something as horrible as sprawl. You all know what sprawl is. It's the sort of rampant automobile-driven nonsense that we do in U.S. cities is legal. It's completely legal. So this is not some kind of desperate slum that has happened in Mumbai. This is a legal instrument that is allowing cities to be destroyed step by step by step. So you cannot say that, you sit there and you say, my God, I cannot do anything about it. Damn it, man. I mean, they're destroying cities every day. So what do? You begin to find the linchpins of change, as you would do in any other city. So in the US, what we have simply done is acknowledge the fact that most cities in the United States, unlike India, are different because they don't have the colossal amounts of poverty and the challenges that you have to face. And you guys are doing an incredible job about that many of us don't know what to do about because we don't face those kind of issues. But what's happening in the US is there are high budget projects, high profile projects. There are low, there are communities that are disenfranchised. But in the middle of these two is a complete mess, as you know. It's a mess because you deal with over-regulation, over-bureaucracy. It takes, 3 years to get a brilliant idea, which you can do in 3 months in India because it might be more creative. So the point I'm making is only this. In the US, what we've simply done is acknowledge the fact that policy means everything. That is the way US works. Policy and law is everything. So if you can forge an activist practice that can change the law, you can actually make enormous transformation in the US. So this is all I'm saying. So the principle is the same. The focus should not be because they've done it, we need to do it. The focus should be on what are the forces that will bring urban transformation in India. That's the question I think we need to ask. In the US, we figured out that it's legal policy because it gives you the ability of forging large-scale transformation. That's not guerrilla. That's not, it's not uninstitutional. It allows you large-scale, complete transformation of cities and architecture and so on. And the only other thing I'll say in the light of inclusivity, to go back to the academic question, because I am a professor, so I'll speak as a prof now, not as a practitioner. I'll make one candid statement. I think we have reduced the profession of architecture to an aesthetic profession. We have reduced it completely. And instead of asking the question, what is architecture, and all the BS we talk about it, we should be asking the question, what can architecture be? If you ask Michelangelo whether he was an architect or a sculptor, he would say, I don't know, I'm a painter. There was a diffusion in everything that there needs to be. There was a time when planning and architecture was diffused. There was a time when public health and planning was diffused. And we have completely over-specialized ourselves, and that's the heart of the problem. So to the degree that we can murk the boundaries and go from being super specialists to intelligent generalists, I think that, to me, is the beginning of a new practice.
Okay. Well, very well put, Vinayak. Thank you all. I mean, if I have to just in very simple terms talk about inclusivity, it's the feeling that I belong wherever it is. I mean, I think, and if that's the case, then our role as architects and designers and every decision that we make, even as guardians of the profession, has to be evaluated from that particular perspective. That we create a sense of belonging and happiness to the people whom we are trying to serve and build communities with. I mean, taking on what Lena was kind of, and the idea of inclusivity, I would like to get some opinion from, say, Abhin and Sameep on this particular topic, and Vinayak in your case, from a US perspective in some sense, because I personally find it still challenging. I mean, we can keep saying that there are opportunities, but I know that as a practice, and it's very difficult for me to today even pre-qualify to be engaged in many of the public projects. And in that sense, if you look at what many of the things that Sameep showed, and to some extent what Abhin showed, is most of them are pro bono work. It started with a pro bono work. It's like, I mean, there was a public space that we initiated here in Chennai, and I worked on it pro bono for a few years, and then finally got everybody excited, the corporation, all of them excited, and they wanted to get it built. And then suddenly they come back to and told us that we don't pre-qualify, and we need to they need to appoint a larger practice to be able to do the same work I could do it as pro bono. And so when it is pro bono, you qualify, but when it is not, you don't. So I disagree that I understand your point that it needs to be built, it needs to be this thing executed, but there is a lot of practices who are ready to do that, and there are some wonderful practices. There is a young practice from Chennai who built the war memorial, and it didn't. I mean, if it had gone through a natural, traditional route, it wouldn't have happened. So I would like, and Samir, I know you've won a competition and then you are told you're lost. So, I mean, you could probably throw some light into that as well. But I think these kind of competitions and through right channels needs to be encouraged. And I think the only way it can be done is through professional bodies. Like Lena said earlier, it can't be done individually. So I would like some opinion from all of you.
A very quick answer, because I really it is frustrating in terms of that. I don't understand why IIA and council architecture is two entities really required in our country. First of all, so there is no accountability in terms of giving a practice to an rational mode to a public realm. Like, there is no coordinations. So I'll give you an example. In Bangladesh, okay, there is one single body, and they negotiate with the government bodies to ascertain the pre-qualifications, competitions, all those things. And tell me, in our country, there'll be one IIA, one Council of Architecture, but there is two loggerheads bodies, and they don't work for architects, honestly. So I think fundamentally there is a systematic problem. And look at the Bangladesh, look at the Sri Lanka. Even a public projects gone through, and in consultation with as an IIA or council, they have one body, and they find out who will be jury. They found out how the process of the pre-qualification happened, and they interact with the government, and they created those kind of projects. And if that can happen with a powerful entity, and it has to be, it's not a fighting with the government. It has to be with you to really play with the politicians, with really play who the bureaucrat is, and make sure that it can end of the day we are losing.
Okay, I'd like to say something in this.
Yeah.
When we talk of institutions, institutions really belong to us. It's never about us and them. It can never be. And if change has to come, then I think all practices, all architects have to start looking at it in a slightly more different way, where you don't disassociate yourself from institutions, but you become a part of it, where you join in. I mean, solutions are never easy. We are responsible for being where we are. And it's and generally, we as a people, somehow we always like to blame the other one. You blame the government for so many things, and if you really interact with them, um, I mean, they state things like, um, people want corruption. I'm saying that's the statement that's made. And they say, if you look at buildings, the man who puts up the building wants more rent, and therefore he wants to violate. And so the government gives you what you want. If you really look at it, perhaps in a sense that is true. I mean, why is it people want it? So there has to change really. We have to stop blaming each other. We've got to come together, and it's possible. I believe it's something that's not so difficult. It just takes time, it takes effort, and it takes people to come together, and change can happen. And we've got to stop seeing things as them and us. It's all about us. It's about you and me. There is no them. It is only us. Who's the them? So if we stop saying them and we say us, I think great change can come. And we can become, a profession of influence. But lawyers are, chartered accountants are, and if you really ask the public, as what they expect that an architect could do, most of them don't even know what what is the additional value of hiring an architect. We cater to 1% of the population. So the day we stop saying them and us, and we look at this whole situation as us, as we have allowed it to come to this stage, I think we can change.
Samip, you want to put some light into it?
Yeah, I'm not sure about light, but I mean, there are questions that we all kind of go through. But in some sense, I think I agree with Lina about the fact that eventually the institution is composed of people like us, right? I mean, and we can sit on the sidelines and criticize everything that's wrong about the institution, but unless we don't partake in kind of improving it nothing changes. And I think it also links back in some sense to this question that was raised about corruption and the fact that we have corruption in governance and so on and so forth. But really, if you ask, maybe Vinayak can kind of also throw some light on that. But really, which part of the world doesn't have corruption in some format or the other, right? I mean, you're dealing with formats of corruption everywhere. Now, what we can do, of course, is or what we've been doing as such, as a profession, has been looking at the architectural project or the design project or the planning project as something that has its own kind of standing. But it's not true. I mean, the minute we realize that there is a kind of political economy under which any project operates and that there are actors who are involved, then there is a chance that architecture can start becoming a part of the conversation to inform decisions that are made about public projects, about public space. However, I think really the blame lies with us as practitioners or as academics or as people who are involved in architecture, that we are not able to position our services, skills, abilities in a way that can make that shows people who are not architects that we make a difference to society at large. And I think until that doesn't change, I don't see any kind of the reason why you're doing pro bono work is because the government or the state or the people who are in spheres of influence don't think that you can make a difference otherwise, right? So the minute you're able to show that there is a kind of improvement or that you have an understanding of the political economy of the situation, where a bureaucrat can then show a change in the way, let's say, drainage in a place works, for instance. I mean, it's just a kind of random, and that an architect had a way to kind of solve that problem. Then there's a value increase. If a politician comes to you, a local councillor comes to you, and a corporator comes to you, or you go to him with an idea that would make public space available for more people, and then those people would be happy and they would vote him into power, let's say. So that is an understanding of the political economy of the situation, right? So the minute you're being able to plug yourself into the political economy, then there is a chance that architecture, the standing of architecture in society in India can change.
Yeah, that's right.
So I'll make 2 points here just to follow up on Samip's thoughts. I'll talk a little bit about Panama, which is more comparable to India. I think I've spoken enough about the U.S. We'll end up doing a lot of work in Panama. Panama, as you know, is a small country in Central America. It's about 5 million people. It's almost like a tiny little city or town in India. But it's comparable to India because of the kind of government murkiness and everything that you guys talk about right now. What we've managed to do in Panama is very simple, actually. We realized that the government is not going to be the agency of change because the government is neither as enlightened nor as knowledgeable, and there's a significant amount of lethargy. They're not going to change rules, nothing. So here's where we've succeeded. I didn't show it today, perhaps I should have. We've managed to find a young generation of developers. Please believe me, I'm going to say this again. The actors who brought change in Panama for us is actually developers. We think developers are the enemies of architects, but all of you will agree that developers are incredibly powerful entities. They can do changes with political entities that you and I cannot dream of doing. So what we managed to do in Panama is tap into some of these younger generations who are exposed to travel, who don't want to do business as usual. They're around. You have to find them. You have to seek them. They're 1 in 100 perhaps. But if you find one, you can actually wield tremendous influence because now you can plant the seed of one project that becomes word of mouth and so on and so forth. Now, why does it become word of mouth? Not because it's idealistic, not because it's aesthetically cool, but because it's profitable. This is extremely important and practical. You cannot bring urban transformation on a mass scale outside the architectural field without economic incentive. So whatever we do, sprawl transformation in the United States has not become successful because it's a great thing to do ethically. Of course it is. But the reason it's been so successful is because cities have realized that the neighboring city has done something so nice, something beautiful, like some of the streets or some projects by all these wonderful architects, that people in my city on the weekend hang out in the neighboring city because I like it so much. So placemaking, great architecture, quality work is economically bringing tax money back into the city. So all of a sudden, my city wakes up and says, I want to do the same thing. The point I'm making is, again, I think the answer doesn't lie in IIA or ITPI or exclusive bodies. The answer for me lies in concerted efforts in tackling the bodies that are far more powerful than architectural and planning bodies, welding political change that you and I cannot, do not, and will not, or never will be able to do. And that's what inclusiveness is about. Inclusiveness is about saying, I can't do certain things. I don't have certain answers. I'm an expert at something, I'm good at something, but I need somebody else to forge things that I cannot do.
Okay, thank you all. I just want to end by this wonderful quote that Bruce Ma often in his book Massive Change, he said, "Massive change is not about the world of design; it's about the design of the world." I think Lisa put it nicely that we need to be. It's all of us together that needs to bring in that change, and hence the idea of collective, and that is why I'm kind of starting to raise that the idea of collective is extremely important and because we are all eventually working on one project, which is the design of the world. We find different ways of doing it, but we are all kind of tied by that one goal, and hence the idea of collective becomes that much important. So I hope we all get involved much more strongly and strengthen both our profession and our practice. Thank you.